Good evening. Welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor. We're pleased to welcome Charles Baxter to our At Home with Literati series in support of his new novel, The Sun Collective, and in conversation this evening with Peter Ho Davies. An overview of webinars, for those who didn't hear me as you first joined, the chat is closed, but you may want to keep the chat window open during the event, as I will be sending links to purchase the Sun Collective from Literati. And there's also a link in the description to purchase books if you're watching later on YouTube. That's right below as well. And you can find more of Charles's books and Peter Ho Davies' novels at the event page that brought you here this evening as well. You can submit questions for Q&A following the conversation this evening using the Q&A feature available to you at any time. So we encourage you, whenever you feel moved to do so, to please feel free to submit questions using that Q&A, and I will ask a selection of them at the conclusion of the conversation. As a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com. We are open online for shopping 24/7. And thousands of titles are available for curbside pickup using our curbside service if you live in the Southeast Michigan area. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of it as this week's or this month's or this year's or maybe next year's subscription to our virtual events, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you might be joining us from. So without further ado, I'll introduce our author and moderator this evening. Charles Baxter is the author of the novels The Feast of Love, nominated for the National Book Award, First Light, Saul and Patsy, Shadow Play, The Soul Thief, and most recently The Sun Collective, and the story collections Believers, Griffin, Harmony of the World, A Relative Stranger, There's Something I Want You to Do, and Through the Safety Net. His stories have been included in the Best American Short Stories. Baxter lives in Minneapolis and teaches at the University of Minnesota and the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson College. And Peter Ho Davies' novel, The Fortunes, won the Ansfield Wolf Award and the Chautauqua Prize and was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. He is the author of The Welsh Girl, longlisted for the Man Booker Prize and a London Times bestseller, as well as two critically acclaimed collections of short stories. His fiction has appeared in Harper's, The Atlantic, the Paris Review, and Granta, has been anthologized in Prize Stories, the O. Henry Awards, and Best American Short Stories. They can't hear you, but they can sense it through the power of the internet. So please join me in welcoming through silent applause Charles Baxter and Peter Ho Davies into your living rooms.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be back in Ann Arbor. Virtually, but even so.
It's good to have you back in town, Charlie. I'm noticing that your bookshelves look a little bit nicer than mine. I have a feeling I'm having bookshelf envy along the way. So, but it feels like a bookstore kind of setting, I think.
Yeah.
Did you want to start us off with a little bit of reading from the novel, or do you want to jump into questions, whatever?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. And in fact, I was thinking that one passage that I'd like to read from the book is from the opening chapter. And one reason that I would like to read it is that when I was first starting on the book 4 or 5 years ago, I was in Ann Arbor and I read this passage at the University of Michigan in Rackham. So although this is not new writing, it is the opening of the book, and the main character is a man of a certain age, really my age, retirement, named Harry Bredigan, and he finds himself on the Minneapolis light rail going out to, in the novel it's called the Utopia Mall. In Minneapolis it's called the Mall of America. And what I would say about it is that as a writer, I love it. I just love it when strangers meet. And as far as plot is concerned, I also like it when one person says to another, there's something I want you to do. So I will read this passage. Harry, who has a heart condition, is headed out to the Mall of America because he's part, as we find out, of a group of senior citizens who call themselves the Thundering Herd, and they exercise in the morning in the mall before the stores are open during cold weather or hot weather. The light rail passed several abandoned grain elevators as blindingly white as the abstract geometries of a Charles Sheeler painting. At 38th Street, a well-tailored gentleman boarded. He wore a three-piece suit, a trench coat, and a soft black trilby hat. The hat made him appear as if he were in costume. He trailed a small suitcase on wheels. His glasses consisted of small tinted circles on thin gold frames, and some property in the lenses reflected light in such a way as to make his eyes nearly invisible. Standing in the aisle next to Bredigan, bathed in soapy blue sunshine, he looked down, smiled, and asked if the seat next to Bredigan's, the one on which Bredigan's baseball cap lay, was taken. No, not at all, Bredigan said, picking up his cap and putting it on. Please sit. The man dropped down in slow motion next to Bredigan, lifting the creases in his trousers in an old-fashioned gesture. Thank you kindly, the man said. He had a trace of a Southern accent. A few moments passed. The man cleared his throat. Thank you, he repeated, looking straight ahead before checking his pocket watch, like the White Rabbit in Wonderland. You have a plane to catch? Bredigan asked, making a social effort. Yes, you could say that, the man said. Where to? Bredigan asked, trying to keep his questions on this side of politeness, the starchy affability one attempts with strangers. Paris, the man said. I'm going to a conference. Well, they talk for a while, and the man identifies himself as Dr. Arthur Jefferson, who is a doctor of what he says is proton analytics. And he, in his conversation with Bredigan, says, Bredigan asks him what proton analytics is, and the doctor drew in a long breath. I'll give you an example, he says. You see that man over there? The man across the aisle wore earbuds, and a stack of pamphlets lay in his lap. The woman seemed to be studying both Bredigan and the doctor. Yes, the doctor affirmed, that one. As soon as I get off this train, he will ask you for money. He will test you. He will beg you for something, anything. You must give him $1 at least. Do you know the legend of Notre Seigneur en pauvre, our Lord in rags? No, Bredigan said. It's a French-Canadian legend of Jesus, the doctor said with low-level excitement as he warmed to his subject. And in this legend, Jesus is dressed as a beggar and is roaming the earth, testing the generosity of everyone he meets. It's a spot quiz for your salvation. You could think of that man over there as Jesus. I recommend that you do so. Did you say that you have a medical condition? Bredigan nodded. The airport is coming up soon, and I shall have to be on my way, the doctor informed Bredigan. But I will tell you another legend that grew up among my people in the South. This one will help you. I guarantee it. It will help you personally. Here is what you must do. What I have for you is a cure for affliction. The doctor now seemed nervously energized and was enunciating his words with care, as if he were speaking to a child with disabilities. Find a mirror, the largest one that you can easily carry. Let's say a hand mirror, and take that mirror to a creek, or even better, to a flowing stream, or best of all, a river. And here is what you must do. You must lower the river. You must lower the mirror into the river. As he spoke, the doctor's hands moved in the air in front of him, pantomiming, or so it seemed to Bredigan, a vigorous form of washing. The water has to flow over the mirror or the cure won't work. And once you have the water streaming over the glass, you wash your reflected face in the mirror, not your actual face, but your mirrored face in the water. Holding the mirror so as not to lose it, you wash your face, your reflected face, and you will recover. And renewed, you will prosper. I give you my personal guarantee. Really, I promise you, you will get better, freed of all your afflictions. This is an ancient cure. It is proven. It is so. There is vast literature to this effect. And that's how the first chapter, well, it doesn't exactly open that way. It opens with Bredigan getting on the train, and it ends with him getting out at the Utopia Mall. But that is what sets the book into motion, along with that young couple who are sitting across the aisle from Bredigan with a pile of pamphlets. And it turns out that the pamphlets are from the Sun Collective, and they're about to go out to the mall and spread these pamphlets out. They believe in pamphlets. They don't believe in the internet. And so that's where the book starts.
So glad you shared that section, Charlie. I remember very well from the reading you gave here a few years ago. And in fact, I think that moment with the wonderful Dr. Jefferson, who feels like he's sort of a magical figure who enters the narrative early on, I think, and sort of changes our relationship to the reality of the space in certain ways. I think you've talked occasionally about characters you describe as Captain Happen, and Dr. Jefferson sort of feels a little like one of those figures in that particular space. But I wanted to think a little bit about that wonderful advice he gives, the cure for affliction, which involves dipping a mirror into the stream and washing the reflected face in the water. And I think, if I remember rightly, mirrors crop up as a motif a few times in the course of the text. Several people are looking at their faces in the mirrors. This idea of washing your face in a mirror crops up again in the context of the narrative. And I suppose as I was reading the book, I was feeling that it was, the Utopia Mall reminds me of this. The book feels like a mirror of our reality in a strange way, right? That the Mall of America passes through the mirror of the novel and comes out on the other side as the Utopia Mall. And as we'll talk about, a figure, a president in the fiction called A.A. Torkelson, feels with his game show smile and his toupee to have a kind of mirror relationship to our world as well. So I guess what I was curious about is your sense of the book's relationship to reality. And maybe following a little bit from what we were talking about even before we came online, the book's relationship to realism, which we sometimes think about as, in the classic way, the mirror in the roadway, the novel reflecting reality.
Right. Right. It's a wonderful question, and I don't want to be too long-winded about this, so I'll try to answer it as concisely as I can. When I started the novel, I thought I was going to be writing a more or less realistic book about uh, contemporary social progressivism and activism. But the more I began to think about it, the more the book began to be affected by what was happening in the political realm. And in a sense, I had a kind of lucky break, which was that I was reading around in the literature of the, and this was now 5 years ago. I was reading about the literature, I was reading in the literature of the 1918 flu epidemic. And one of the books I was reading had a kind of inventory of folklore cures and folklore prevention for the 1918 flu epidemic. And believe it or not, one of those modes was to take a mirror, lower it into the water. And this was an idea that was predominantly in the South. Lower a mirror in the water and wash your face in it. And the idea was that it would prevent you from getting the flu. And one night I found myself, before I had started writing the book, I found myself at dinner with another writer who lives in Minneapolis. Well, it was Louise Erdrich. And I told her about this country cure for the flu. And Louise looked at me in this predatory way and said, if you don't use that, I will. So I started writing this book using that as a kind of pivot. And I found that what I was writing was not in a conventional form of realism. In fact, what it was a sort of wonderland. And your idea of the mirror is absolutely germane here, because I thought that what my characters were doing was to go through a kind of looking glass into a wonderland which is like our own world, but which is running, it's not at 98.6 Fahrenheit, it's running a fever. And as I worked on the book, the more feverish in some sense it became, because and you and I have talked about this, I began to feel that realism as a mode works very well when everybody agrees what reality is. And that when there is no agreement on what reality is, then realism as a mode of writing is not going to work as well. So my book has, to mix a kind of metaphor, my book has one foot in realism and another foot in what I would call Wonderland, or the world of vision, a sort of fever dream.
That makes sense to me. I suppose I'm tempted, it's possibly wishful thinking or dream logic, to imagine if the book is a mirror, then looking into it might be, and seeing our own reflection in that space might be a cure for our various afflictions in various ways.
Well, maybe so.
And otherwise.
Maybe so.
It would be a nice, certainly a nice hope. And I did feel at times heartened and certainly amused and very moved at moments through the course of the book, and to some degree enraged as well. So it feels like it captures our times in really wonderful ways. And I suppose that's the question. You began to allude to this already in terms of talking about the process of the writing and when you started the book, and some of the germs, the seeds for it. But it strikes me as a remarkably timely book. It feels very much of our moment politically, almost uncannily so in various ways. And I have a great deal of admiration, almost awe, where that's concerned, because I think writers, as we have, as a community of writers, been talking about a fair bit lately, but this also goes back to the aftermath of 9/11. We're caught in that space, that anxiety of, is it too soon or are we too late, right? We don't ever quite get that Goldilocks moment where the book is written and comes out when it is still timely. And you seem to have struck upon that, it seems to me. And I'm curious about, I guess I'm still curious about the progression of the book, changes that may have occurred as you were in the midst of writing it, if you felt like you were running to keep up with current affairs, if at certain points you had to turn away from them in various ways. It feels like a magical, alchemical achievement to arrive at a timely book that shows up at the right moment for us. And I'm just wonderstruck at how you pull that off. So I'm kind of curious about the experience.
Yeah. I didn't want to write a book that was making a series of political points. It wasn't as if I wanted to say this is good and this is bad and here is the illustration of that. A good deal of the book simply came out of maybe two things. One is that I live in downtown Minneapolis. And if I want to go to the supermarket, if I want to go to Target, I just walk out on the street. And in downtown Minneapolis, if you want to walk anywhere, you're going to meet up with homeless people. And if the situation is the way it usually is, they will ask you for something. And if they're willing to talk to me, I like to have conversations with them. And several of the conversations that I had with homeless people in my neighborhood went almost verbatim into this book. There's one guy who talks to Bredigan late at night. He asks him for a beer, asks him for $1 for a beer. And Bredigan says, oh, I will give you $1, but I'd rather you didn't buy a beer. And the guy says, what's the matter? Are you from AA? And Bredigan says, no. And Bredigan says, where do you sleep at night? And the guy says, I sleep on the light rail. Bredigan asks him, why don't you go to the shelter? And the homeless guy says, there are a lot of creeps in there. And besides, they won't let me in. And Bredigan asks him, why won't they let you in? And the guy says, because I'm a drunk. And Bredigan says, well, why don't you stop drinking? And the guy says, because I'm crazy. That conversation is almost verbatim a conversation that I had with a guy on the light rail stop at 5th and Hennepin. And a lot of those conversations, a lot of the things that I've seen in downtown Minneapolis went into the book, combined with some reading I was doing about the political history of the city I live in. When I was living in Ann Arbor, I was thinking a lot about what sort of a city that was and what kinds of histories caused that city to be the way it is. I lived in Ann Arbor for 30 years. And in Minneapolis has a very interesting political history. There was a truckers union here in the 1930s, mostly made up of communists who were followers not of Stalin, but of Trotsky. And there were staged battles in downtown Minneapolis between these guys. They were all guys. And business owners and a fascist contingent that was also very strong, followers of Charles Lindbergh, called the Silver Shirts. I was just at the Weissman Art Museum, where there's an exhibit now of materials related to the silver shirt movement in Minneapolis in the 1930s. And so it got me to thinking of what has happened to progressivism. What is it that you feel you should do when you walk around a city and you see people who need help? What kind of political action are you moved to take, and how much of that do you feel you need to do on your own? So it kind of naturally led to ideas of neighborhood collectives, people who were starting neighborhood gardens, who were having free stores. There's a lot of that here in the city. And what would happen if some of the members of a group like that, I'm sorry to go on at such length, what would happen if some members of groups like that were tired of small, deliberate improvements and wanted something much more radical and soul-wrenching? And so I didn't want to write about Trump. Everybody's tired of Trump. Everybody's tired of what has happened. What I wanted to do instead was to, Chekhov simply says you have to ask the right question. And for me, the right question was, what are we going to do? What are people doing? What are they thinking of doing? And so, I have two couples in the book, Harry and Alma Bredigan, whose son has gone to live on the streets, and Christina, a younger couple, Christina and her boyfriend Ludlow, and it's a sort of convergence narrative where they meet up with each other.
I think that's great. What's so fascinating about that, we were talking earlier on about the reality of the book, its realism, the way that it's reflecting, through this sort of mirror sense, our own reality. And yet, all the things you've just described are a great foundation in the actual lived reality. It's place, right? It's about people, the localness of reality. It feels like the distortion field where the unreality begins to come in is sort of a little bit beyond, where people look beyond their immediate family, their immediate interactions, their neighborhood interactions in a sense, and begin to look up into the bigger picture, I think, in various ways. But it's clear that the book sort of steeps itself in a reality that is local, it's of the place, right? It does feel very much like this book is, I was thinking about this as your Minnesota novel in the way that I think of, or your Minneapolis novel, in the way that I think of The Feast of Love as your Ann Arbor novel in a certain sense, right? They feel as though they call back to each other in some ways. And it feels really grounded in that reality. And as you've just described, really grounded in the history of that place as well. Yeah. And maybe that's the, in a strange way, the book partly, I think in ways that really move me, feels elegiac maybe for the country, maybe elegiac eventually, I think, for the characters in some ways as well, but also maybe for that history, maybe even elegiac for the grasp we have upon reality in some ways as well. But I found that very moving.
Yeah. Well, I think that without becoming too abstract or philosophical about it, I think that one of the problems that young people are facing now is the erasure of a usable future. It's as if my generation has somehow done something horrible to the whole sense of possibility, the possibility of the future. And at the same time, there has been a kind of eradication of norms, which means that reality has been somehow subverted. And that's a terrible place to be in. if you feel that reality has been subverted in some way, and there's very little future, you're in a bad place. I just want to read one paragraph where Bredigan has a feeling for this. Watching a mailman advancing down the block, pushing his little trolley sack of letters before turning to drop some advertising brochures into a mail slot, Bredigan broke out in a cold sweat. He felt old and sick. Chills and fever burst into blossom gently along his spine. The doorway that had opened for him led into the land of the unreal, where most young people, their eyes fixed on their screens, lived nowadays. Realism was over. It had crumbled. This was the world we had now. This duplicate, this realm of unlikeness, even here on Haas Street, where nothing solid remained, and bogus birds shrieked in the cardboard trees. But I have to say that as bleak as I'm making this out to be, in fact, by the end of the novel, there is a kind of future posited. Structurally, the book is a comedy because it ends with a marriage.
It's true,
and in some sense, at the beginning, the family has started to disintegrate with the lost child who's gone to live on the street. At the end, the child has been found. He's got himself a life. There's a marriage in the offing. There may be a future after all.
That's right. I think there is a future for those characters, and there is some uplift in that moment. I think the elegiac quality for me comes in that way in which, as a new marriage is being formed, an older marriage, which is beautifully depicted in the course of the book, really movingly so, and richly so, and just wittily and dryly observantly so, feels like it is gradually moving into kind of a disillusionment, I suppose, in some ways as well. So it almost feels as though what the older generation are stepping aside for the younger is the hope for the younger generation, partly because of the receding of the older in some ways. Maybe this is an odd and slightly morbid question to ask, Charlie, but I noticed when John was introducing you, he mentioned you teach at the University of Minnesota, and I was thinking you recently retired, and that feels like a cause of celebration, but maybe also some stock taking in various ways. And I was curious. I mean, I'm interested in the way this book speaks back to some of your previous work. I mentioned the Feast of Love already. I think I mentioned to you on an email. There's a wonderful story of yours that I had not thought about for a while, but this recalled called The Next Building I Plan to Bomb, that sort of sense of lingering threat and violence somehow behind the surface of the veneer of our world. But I was also thinking about what comes next, how the future changes with retirement. How are you thinking into those spaces? This book seems to think about age. I'm curious about how you're looking forward to retirement.
If you don't mind my broadening your question a little bit, it seems to me actually that my retirement has become a kind of crazy funhouse mirror for the sort of retirement that half of 3/4 of the American people are experiencing. We're all in a sort of retirement right now. And you know, when I looked forward to retirement, I thought, well, I'll do some traveling. I'll go to more concerts, I'll go to more movies, I'll go to more plays, I'll go to more performances of every kind. But that's not the retirement I've had so far. And in fact, I don't know how others have experienced this, but I've found that something has happened to my time sense since I stopped teaching and since I started to keep myself in quarantine more or less. Uh, Reading that I once thought would take too long, reading Joseph Frank's biography of Dostoevsky, for example, I thought, oh, I haven't got time for that. Well, now I do.
There's some lines in the book that speak to this, right?
Reading the endless novels of Dorothy Richardson, plenty of time for that. Want to get back to Proust? Well, you can do that. I think all of us are having our time sense changed by what we are living through with both with the virus and politically what we're living through. So I don't think necessarily I've become more retrospective. I just feel that I have more time to do, particularly to do the reading that I might have put off at one point. Now anything that I want to read, I've got the time to read it.
You're reminding me of lines in the book. I think there's a moment, it may be Christina who talks about the coldness of the Minnesota winter. And she's talking about in the frigid air, time itself had been frozen, which somehow felt like it resonated very much with the moment we were going through. And maybe Bredekin himself talks about having history has stopped today, he says at one point. So that sense of being frozen in time does feel like it inhabits the book, actually. That's a really nice observation. I'm wondering too, I think for myself, the time sense is scrambled partly by the sense of being, as you know, I'm secluded and sort of quarantined largely with my family, including my now 16-year-old son, Owen, who still refers to you occasionally as my Baxter because he's very fond of his Uncle Charlie. And you've recently, or relatively recently, become a grandfather. And so one of the things I think about is I'm also scrambled, I think, because I'm coexisting with a younger person whose time sense is somewhat different. For a 16-year-old in this moment, the idea of being in lockdown for a year seems eternal. Whereas from my position, while it's certainly challenging, it doesn't feel like that large a percentage of my life in various ways. So I think that's maybe adding to that scramble a little bit in certain ways as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the ways of addressing your question is academic, and to say that I'm a great admirer of the writing of Virginia Woolf. And in Virginia Woolf, there are often these moments that are like Wordsworthian spots of time where time stops. It's hard to get away with that, I think, in literature of our period. And the way that I thought I could do it in this book was by inventing a drug, which I called blue telephone, and which rips a hole in a kind of space-time continuum for the person who takes it. I don't think there is any such drug, and I'm not sure whether Quaaludes or whatever you take would have the effect that blue telephone has on Christina. But I felt that I had to get into the book somehow a sense of ruptures in time that my characters were feeling. And using a drug to do it was a sort of shortcut. But I think it's also, I hope it's accurate to the way that a lot of people feel in a time when something has happened to the sense of continuity.
Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah, and you're living here, and then this almost disappears on you, and then you're living here, and you can remember this, but you can't remember how you got there.
Right. It's reminding me actually of, and I'm aware, of course, time a little bit of our back and wanting to make sure we have time for audience questions as well. But one of the wonderful ways in which you are not writing about Trump, but also writing about Trump, there's a lovely sort of fantastical, he's also in the mirror world in a strange way, I suppose, in the form of Torkelson, who has, despite the fact that I think at one point he levies a 40% tax on books, if I'm remembering correctly.
He does.
Yeah. He's also the author of his monthly poem that he puts out to the nation. And my favorite line, it's a wonderful poem, so to speak. For the purpose
it was the worst poem I worked very hard on making it a bad poem.
It's gloriously terrible. It is the most terrible poem, perhaps we could say.
Shall I recite the first stanza?
Well, I was going to ask you, actually, I was thinking about the last line, felt particularly apposite, but you could certainly do maybe the first stanza and the last line, and then we can move into some questions from the audience there.
Well, if I can find it. You know what page it's on?
Oh, let me see. I'm not sure I have the reference in front of me. I'm flicking through. Oh, wait a minute. It is on, in my edition here, page 242 and 243.
Okay. All right. Brace yourself. No free lunch. At the local supermart, I saw a sight to make me weep. A woman buying tubs of slaw with her eyes closed, half asleep. At the cash register, she paid for junk food with a wad of food stamps. And this made me very, very, very sad. For she was super fat and didn't need, I can't bear to read this. It's so awful. The last stanza, no more, the voters bray, fat lady, you have been sacked. For we have heard a wise man say, the times they are a-changing back.
Yeah,
that's actually not my line, and it's not Torkelson's line either. It comes from a wonderful movie called Bob Roberts.
That's right, of course. I wondered where I was doing that.
Which Tim Robbins made. And so in the acknowledgement of this book, I put in a thank you to Bob Roberts and Tim Robbins.
It's a lovely callback there. It makes us think about the way time has been reversed in a political context in some ways as well. And so again, speaks to that dislocation we feel in time, I think, as well. Well, maybe we'll ask John to come back on in and share questions from the audience with us.
Yeah, we do have a few questions. We should have time for most of them, but if you do want to sneak one of your questions in, you can still do so while we're talking. The first question, there's a way in which you talk about this novel that is reminiscent of Doris Lessing's Golden Notebooks, except for the surrealistic elements. Can you say more about how the folk traditions and lore come into play to change the course of the younger couple's lives, or does it?
What a great question. I'm thinking, could you repeat it? I want to make sure
Absolutely.
that I've got the question right.
There's a way in which you talk about this novel that is reminiscent of Golden Notebooks, except for the surrealistic elements. Can you say more about how the folk traditions and lore come into play to change the course of the younger couple's lives, or do they?
It's almost the folklore traditions are not so much at play in the lives of Christina and Ludlow. What is at work in their lives, particularly Christina. Christina has had an academic background and has wanted to be a political activist and has been trained in critical theory and deconstruction, which leaves her kind of high and dry when she's actually looking for a job. Ludlow has a kind of similar background and a sort of half assimilated emotional Marxism and a passion for revolution, to the extent that they are activists. They're, they both come from rural areas, but I wouldn't say that folklore or folklore traditions have affected them as much as the wish to do some good and to bring about some great change. And to the extent that they are from backgrounds where that is accepted and is honorable, that is what really has affected them.
Thank you. A viewer writes in, thank you for this wonderful conversation. Can you talk about choosing to make Bredigan a retired structural engineer and bridge designer? I loved reading about Minneapolis places through his eyes.
Oh, thank you. Well, you know, the great fiction about these sorts of authorial talks is that if I were a truly serious writer, I would say I had to make Bredigan a structural engineer who designs bridges because it fits the thematic necessity of the novel. Nothing of the sort. He's a structural engineer and a bridge designer because my son is a structural engineer and a bridge designer. And early on in the construction of this book, I thought that some members of the Sun Collective would bomb a bridge in the effort to bring it down. Minneapolis has a kind of dark memory of the I-35 bridge collapsing. And when it first collapsed, there was some talk around town that maybe radical groups had been responsible for that. I mean, that idea disappeared fairly quickly. But I made Bredigan a bridge engineer because I thought it was possible that this group would think of large scale destructive activities like that. And I wanted to ask my son whether and how it would be possible. And basically he told me it wouldn't be possible. It's very hard to bring a bridge down. So that's why he's a bridge engineer. But at the end, he dreams of bridges. He closed his eyes and thought of a bridge he would design for her, for all of them. It would be a pedestrian bridge formed by a slender and heavily post-tension concrete deck, the cables anchored to stiff foundations at either end. A stress ribbon bridge would have the shape of gently sloping catenary curves. To support the deck, the post-tensioning cables would exert large historical forces at the abutments, suited to locations where the ground consisted of solid rock at the ends of the span. The ribbon bridge that Bredigan saw in his imagination would be well suited to a river. He saw all of them, the shadows, crossing over on his bridge to rest in the shade of the trees. I mean, the last sentence is are the dying words of Stonewall Jackson. Let us cross the river and rest in the shade of the trees. But the rest of that paragraph was written by my son. I didn't write it. That's his prose, it isn't mine.
That's beautiful, Charlie. And actually, it makes all the sense in the world that Bennigan's a bridge designer, because it means that Daniel is in the book, and the book is about a father and son's love
Yeah,
for each other. That's
yeah,
lovely.
yeah. And Bredigan, this spoiler alert, but Bredigan is dying at that moment. And he's thinking of this bridge crossing into the next realm.
We've got one more question. It's about composition. You briefly mentioned the convergence narrative within your book. I was curious as to how you went about having that within the story. Was it always your intention to have these two stories come together, or did it come about more naturally or accidentally?
Both, in a way. I had Bredigan and his wife first, and I wrote the first section of the novel with them, and I got down on paper what I could about them. I had an acute tension, which was the loss of their son, who's living on the streets, and a chronic tension, which is that their marriage is, it's not rocky. They both love each other, but they're tired of each other. They're just tired of each other. And when I had written about 80 pages of that, I thought, I need a contrast. I need a counterpoint to these older people. I need a young couple, and it was much harder for me to write. I need a young couple who are not mirrors of Bredigan and his wife, but who are preoccupied by some similar things. And so, I mean, when you're working on a book, you naturally think of counterpoints, of contrast, and of conflict. And to have an older couple who have been together for 40 or 50 years naturally gives rise, I think, to a young couple who have just met each other and are beginning a relationship. Here's a couple at the end of their lives and their relationship, and here's a couple who are beginning their relationship, and what if they met? What if they became, if not friends exactly, acquaintances? So, you know, the structure of the book is like that.
Thank you. Well, we've reached the top of the hour. I wish I could I got to have some time to talk about all sorts of fun and exciting things with Peter and Charles before we went live. And I wish you could go on longer, but I wanted to make sure that both of you can eat dinner and continue your peaceful lives. So I just want to thank you both again, Charles Baxter, Peter Ho Davies. Thank you so much for joining us at home with Literati this evening.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Thank you to everybody who came too.
And yes, thank you to all our attendees. We hope you continue to be safe and stay well. And we hope to see you at the next event. But until then, take care. Good night, everybody.
Good night.